We've been talking about hearing God in these last couple of weeks. What is it like to hear God? What does it mean to receive guidance from God? And we've seen how the scriptures tune our ears to hear God's voice. And we've seen how we need other people to help us hear God. And I think there's a third piece that we've got to keep in mind as we seek to be a people who are open and listening to the voice of God. And that third piece is our circumstances. God speaks to us through the circumstances of our life. And what this means is that there are going to be times when the circumstances of our life come together in such a way that we realize God is communicating to us by those circumstances. And we're going to realize in those moments that God has placed us right here, right now, with a purpose. Now, maybe you've had this kind of experience. You especially see it in the life of Esther. I mean, Esther is a very interesting book. It was originally written in Hebrew, and the book of Esther describes a time during the Persian Empire, during the reign of Ahasuerus or Xerxes, when the Jewish people are almost wiped out by the machinations of the evil and jealous Haman. Haman has this personal grudge against Esther's uncle Mordecai that turns into a grudge against the whole Jewish people. And the Jewish people who are living in Persia after the nation of Israel was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the best and the brightest were carted off from Israel and were taken to be a part of the Babylonian regime. And later the Persians come and they conquer Babylon, and this kind of scenario continues. And so here are the Jewish people hoping against hope that they really will get to return to their land after 70 years, as the prophet Jeremiah has promised. And here's Esther, this orphan raised by her uncle who becomes queen after the king of Persia has a beauty contest to determine who would be the next queen. It's quite a story. The whole book revolves around this series of banquets. It's about these festivals. It's about eating. And in fact, the book of Esther tells the story of the establishment of the Jewish festival of Purim. And I've never been to a Purim celebration in a Jewish synagogue, but I understand that it is a kind of a raucous party where people will bring noisemakers, kind of like you might see on New Year's Eve. They'll write Haman's name on the bottom of their shoes, and every time they hear the name of Haman, they boo and make noisemakers and stamp their shoes, right? So it's this kind of party, this kind of celebration. That's Purim. Now there's another thing that's really interesting about the book of Esther. And it's the way that the wicked Haman sets the date for the destruction of the Jewish people. He does it by casting lots. That's what the Pur are, the Purim. He essentially rolls dice. And so the date that comes up on the dice is just going to be a few weeks before the Jewish festival of Passover. So they know the date that Haman has set when the Jewish people will be destroyed, and they know the date of Passover, and they're going to be destroyed just a few weeks before Passover. So you remember Passover, right? And the meaning of Passover. It's the big one, right? It's the time when the people of Israel celebrate that God brought them out of slavery in Egypt, that God established them as a people. So in the book of Exodus, it was plagues, rivers turning to blood, darkness and hail, and grasshoppers gobbling up the crops, the death of the firstborn. It was the water of the Red Sea piling up so that the people of Israel could walk through, but the people of Egypt could not. It was manna and quail in the desert. It was water from the dry rock. It was God right there with the people in this huge pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. I mean, that's what the people of Israel are remembering at Passover. That's what they're celebrating. It's this foundational story in the Old Testament. And here's the thing. Passover is about miracles and God's power and God's presence to rescue his people. And Esther has none of that. Do you know how many times the name God or a name for God appears in the book of Esther? You don't even need one hand to count them. It's none. The word God does not appear in Esther. None of the names of God appear in Esther. There's no Almighty, there's no Lord, there's no Father. There is no name of God at all in Esther. The word pray doesn't even appear in Esther, at least in the Hebrew version of Esther. In the Greek version that is in the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, the name of God is all over the place. There's some extra parts that are there, some parts that were in the Greek, and there's a long prayer from Esther, a long prayer of Mordecai. But in the Hebrew, The name of God does not appear, and prayer does not appear. And I think one of the messages that the Bible is communicating through the book of Esther is that God is at work. God rules over history, even when it's not obvious and even when it's not explicit. And I think part of the focus of the book of Esther is the role of human beings in the work of God. So think about this. If Passover puts the emphasis on God's work and what God does, his actions, and then the festival of Purim in the book of Esther really puts the emphasis on human action. So Mordecai comes to Esther, and what a beautiful way to just capture that, Karen. Thank you so much for that. But Mordecai comes to Esther, and he says to her in chapter 4, verse 14, "Who knows? Perhaps you have come into royal position for such a time as this. It's you, Esther, right here, right now. You are the one who has to act. This is why you're in this place at this time." And Mordecai is really playing the role of prophet to Esther. I mean, he's helping her see that God has brought her to that time and place with a purpose. Mordecai is saying, look at your circumstances. God can use somebody else if he needs to, but you are here in this moment for a reason. It is all you, Esther. You know that song that we sang? Donna played it last week. Here I am, Lord, right? Is it I, Lord? You know that song? Well, you can kind of imagine like that song with like a little record stop. Like, here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? Yes, it's you, Esther. I've brought you to this place and to this time, says the Lord, for this exact circumstance. Is it I? It's you. I mean, just look at Esther's life. She's this orphan brought up by her uncle Mordecai after her parents die, and she's beautiful, and she's chosen to be in the running for the queen's pageant, and she's then the one who is picked, and here she is in just the right time, in just the right place. And I think part of the message of the book of Esther is that God is at work in the circumstances of our lives, that we should expect this, that we should be asking ourselves, why has God brought me to this time and this place? Because and I think this is one of the tragedies of our modern moment. It's easy to think that life is just a big accident, a series of one thing after another, a series of disconnected events. And I think that's a very tragic vision of life. But I think the view of the scriptures is that the midst of what seems like a bunch of random accidents, God is there. And things may just seem like a coincidence, but God is inviting us to look deeper. Have you ever experienced this? It can kind of be eerie when something happens, when we meet someone, or something lines up, or life comes together just so. And it's like, wow, that's almost too much of a coincidence for it to be a coincidence. Has God ever used a coincidence to guide you? Now, I had a chance to interview a Methodist pastor named Connie Stutz, who serves a little congregation on the coast of rural North Carolina, actually near New Bern, which was in the news yesterday with this terrible hurricane. So I was thinking of her. She was on my mind. And she told me how the people in her congregation, this little Methodist church in a rural community, people in her congregation, they looked around and they said, we're declining, we're getting older, we've got no children. And so there were several older women in that congregation who got together and they started to pray. And they said, God, we need children. And they just pray week in and week out, said, Lord, send us some kids. We don't have any children. And then the government began to relocate refugees, Karen refugees, to their little community. How does this happen? How does the government pick that little community? But the government begins to relocate Karen refugees from their little community. Many of them probably would have had no idea where these folks would have come from. They would have been people from different parts of Asia. There's not one country where the Karen people are at, but they have suffered from war and violence for many decades. And they were getting relocated in their little community, and through a series of circumstances, including a tragic traffic accident, some of those folks began to connect to the church. It's a little bit like that movie that we watched last year, except most of these folks were Buddhist by background. And so some of them started to connect to the church, and those women who had been praying for children kind of looked up and realized That this wasn't exactly what they had imagined when they began to pray, but they said, these must be the children we were praying for. And the Karen people have become a very important part of this little Methodist church in a little rural community in North Carolina. You know, that was the way their circumstances came together. God might be calling us to pay attention to the so-called circumstances of our lives and to look deeper. Now, I mean this in the sense of how we look at the whole arc of our lives, where we were born, what family we came into, what gifts we have, how we're wired, the work that we choose. I think all of those are places where God is at work in meaningful ways. But I also mean this in the day-to-day aspects of our lives, who we bump into on the street, the conversations that we have, the moments when our wondering attention snaps to and reflects that something profound is happening, and God's showing up in those moments. Because you know what, brothers and sisters, life is not an accident. You should see yourself as being at this place and this time for a purpose, right here, right now. And God has brought us to this place for such a time as this. And I think part of receiving the leading of God and being open to his guidance means attending to what's going on around us. How is God leading us through our circumstances? Now, in the scriptures, we have instances where people hear the voice of God. And it seems like what they heard was an audible voice. That's the way it was for little Samuel last week, right? Samuel, Samuel, and he gets up and runs to Eli. And sometimes I think that's how it will be for us. There will just be this clear and compelling sense that God has spoken to you. God has given you a particular direction. But we also have the story of Esther. There's no voice. There's no dream. Mordecai plays the role of the prophet, but he doesn't even mention God. And he goes to Esther, and she's there. What will she do? In essence, what Mordecai is telling Esther is that she should take seriously that God is speaking to her through those circumstances. Mordecai's not even pushy about it. He just says, who knows, right? Who knows? Esther, it's a possibility. It could be. It's life in the subjunctive tense. Perhaps God has brought you to royal power for just such a time as this. God speaks to us through our circumstances. It's God speaking through providence. And it seems to me that there are several reasons that God operates this way. And the first is that God desires us above all that we grow into maturity in Christ. God desires to give us the space to become his co-workers, as the Apostle Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians. So our desires can become God's desires. And God works with our desires to accomplish his ends. So too, what we think counts for the voice of God is just too limited. And, you know, what I'm going to say can get very abstract very quickly. But what we consider to be reality is in fact only a small slice of what's actually going on. So we are only aware of so much. We only have 5 senses. You know, just take the simple things. We cannot perceive radio waves that are undulating through our bodies. We do not see all the colors that are out there. And so this thing that we call hearing is only one segment of all the sensory phenomena that are out there. And even so, hearing is not always that dependable. How many times do we say to someone, "What did you say?" Right? Or how many times have you been in a meeting or at a doctor's visit or whatever, and you've had someone else with you, and one person says, "Well, I heard this," and the other one says, "Well, that's not what I heard," right? So, you know, hearing is not actually the gold standard of communication. And God has more bandwidth available to him to communicate with us than just the audible voice. And anyway, hearing doesn't always move us. Maybe this is one of those learning style things where different people learn in different ways. But I think sometimes the most effective way to communicate a truth to someone is to let them see it, to let them experience it. So think about Job in the scriptures. He has this encounter with God at the end of the book of Job, and he says, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." And I think part of this has to do with the way that we relate to God as human beings. God is not one more being out there among many like we are to one another. God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And consequently, God can speak to us through all of those complex ways that we live and move and have our being in him, including our circumstances. And so we have to be paying attention to where we are and to what's going on around us. I got invited to speak at a church event earlier this year, and as I was going out the door on Sunday evening, I was going out the door of the hotel, and I was going to go speak at the church, and I've got my stuff together. I'm going out the door of the hotel, and the guy at the front desk looks up and goes, "You look caffeinated." Now, I will neither confirm nor deny that I was caffeinated at the moment, but I said, "Yeah, man, I'm just getting up for the game, right? Just getting ready to go speak." And so I went on my way. Well, I happened to be speaking about evangelism that night, right? And so I told that story. I just said this funny thing happened, and someone says, "Well, look, Pastor, maybe God was speaking to you and opening a door for you to talk to that person that asked you that question on the way out." And I said, "I know." And so when the workshop was over, I went back and I went in and sat down and struck up a conversation with this young man. And we talked about life and faith and everything in between. And for me, it was this moment when the circumstances matter. And when it all came together, and God was setting me up to talk to him or not. Now, the thing about God speaking to us through our circumstances, that God is what God says to us is not always going to be what we think God ought to be saying or what God could be saying. We may think that God is telling us a conversion story or a transformation story or something made for TV, for Hallmark. It's something dramatic. But it could be that God is simply calling us to be awake to who he is in that moment, to what he's up to in our life and the life of whoever's around us. Now, shortly after we moved to Washington State and I began to serve the church out there, I was driving on a country road and heading to a meeting, and somebody blew a stop sign, and I T-boned him hard. And we had this Toyota Camry, and after all was said and done and the airbags had deflated, this thing was crushed like a pop can. And so here I am, and I kind of do this like internal check, and it's like, okay, everything is okay. And then I get out, and I go over to see what's going on with the other people, and the accident, the EMT folks, they come really fast, and I'm standing there, I'm interpreting for these people because they only spoke Spanish, and one of the EMTs is, they're laying them out on the stretchers, and the EMT's like, "Who's the other driver of the other car?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's me." And first off, they were kind of amazed because that car did not look good, thanks be to God. But then I had this idea, right? I was like, what's going to come of this? Because here I am connecting to this family, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to be a witness to Christ in this whole thing, because here I was so clearly and dramatically not dead that it seemed like something big ought to come out of this. That God had clearly preserved me through these circumstances for such a time as this. But that was it. That was the story. I never saw them or talked to them again. It never went anywhere except for a bunch of insurance paperwork and a few visits to the chiropractor. It really wasn't the story that I expected. But that doesn't mean that God wasn't involved in those circumstances, speaking something into both of our lives. It just wasn't what I thought. This is the challenge with God speaking to us through our circumstances. We won't always know what it means. And sometimes we can tie ourselves in knots trying to figure out what God's saying, thinking, there must be a sign from God in there somewhere, and we want to wrestle something dramatic out of our circumstances. There's kind of this pastor story, right? That a lady who wanted guidance from God, and she was thinking about taking a trip. This lady wanted guidance, so she went to the side of her bed, and she was at the side of her bed praying, "Lord, should I take this trip?" And she had her eyes closed, and she was praying, and she opened her eyes and looked at her alarm clock. The digital alarm clock read 7:47. And she goes, "Oh, I knew it, God. You want me to take that trip, 7:47. There it is, God's guidance in an alarm clock. And yeah, sure, God can speak through an alarm clock. But sometimes the way we respond to our circumstances is going to be different than what we expect. And we're not going to know right off what God is saying to us. And sometimes what God's calling us to do is to challenge our circumstances, to change things. And that can be a faithful response too. I mean, not everything that happens in life is what God desires. Not everything that happens is God's will. Circumstances by themselves aren't enough to plot out a direction for life. We need the scriptures to shape our imaginations. We need the Spirit to light our hearts on fire. And above all, we're always going to need wisdom. It is no good to be a thermometer, just reflecting the temperature of what's around us, right? That's what a thermometer does, right? It has no choice. It goes up when it's hot, goes down when it's cold. Well, it's no good just to be a thermometer, taking a read of what's going on. There's nothing holy about allowing circumstances to dictate the terms of our living. Any dead fish can go downstream. We're called to be thermostats, right? Thermostats are different. They set the temperature. They challenge. If you want it warm, you turn up the thermostat. You want it cold, you turn it down. So we challenge circumstances that are unjust or unholy. We stand out as children of God. Now, I think a little bit of the story of Dirk Willems, and this has got to be one of the most famous stories in the Martyr's Mirror. You know, the Martyr's Mirror, that great big book that tells the testimonies of people who have given their lives for the faith in Christ. And so Willems was an Anabaptist, and he gets arrested back in the 1500s. He gets arrested for seeking to practice his faith. They lock him in a tower, but he manages to escape out of the tower by making a rope out of rags. And it's winter. And Willems tears off, running through the snows, right? He's managed to get down out of the tower. There he is. He's trying to escape, trying to live, and he runs through the snow. And there's this guard who sees him and chases after him, and he's wearing heavy armor. And Willems gets to an icy river and just scuttles across it. And the guard tries to follow, and the guard's wearing this armor, and the ice can't hold his weight, and it cracks. And the guard falls through, and he's there calling for help, right? Help me. And so what do? The circumstances are such that you might be thinking that God did this, that God made it possible for you to escape by cracking that ice. Maybe it's like the Egyptians chasing the Israelites through the Red Sea. I mean, this is it. Make a break for it. Now's your chance. But that's not what Willems does. He turns back, pulls the guard from the icy water, and by this time the commander has arrived, some other guards have arrived, and he orders that very guard who Willems just arrested who just saved, to arrest Willems, take him back to prison. And Willems eventually dies in prison. Now, I don't know about you, but I think Willems did the right thing under the circumstances. I might have kept on running, but Willems stops. And I think what was God saying to him, right? What was God trying to communicate to him? And I think he got it right. God was giving him the opportunity to give his life in those circumstances as a testimony to the love of Christ. Now, here's the thing. Just as with Esther, God speaking to us through our lives and circumstances will not mean that we have perfect knowledge. Look at how it went for Esther. She was afraid. She fasted for 3 days. She asked others to fast with her. She didn't know if when she entered the king's presence she would live or die. She was uncertain about what to do, which is why Mordecai goes to her and tries to convince her. Esther has neither perfect knowledge nor perfect courage. And even Mordecai, who in some ways is playing the role of prophet, he says, who knows? Who knows, Esther? Maybe God has brought you to royal power for such a time as this. We may wonder if God is in the mix at all, or if it's just all a bunch of scruffy coincidences. Writer Dallas Willard asks, though, can a person be sure that God has not spoken to them? And we can't always be sure that God has or has not spoken to us. But that's when we have to act, to take seriously that God is at work in our lives and circumstances, that coincidences are often so much more than coincidences. You're right here, right now for a reason. God has brought you here. God is at work. God is speaking to you. What's he calling you to do or to be? Now, back when I was in high school, I had a friend, and we would get together and we would play chess. Neither of us was any good. We hadn't learned any techniques, and we played these brutal, inelegant games where there'd be hardly any pieces left on the board when we were done. And here's what would happen. Sometimes when we were playing chess, we'd get so lost in thought, so concentrated on trying to make the next perfect move, we'd both be staring at the chessboard for a really long time, and then one of us would say, it's your turn, right? And the other one would inevitably say, no, I was waiting for you. It's your turn. Well, like Esther, God is bringing you to the place where you are as the person you've become with a purpose, with a plan for such a time as this, right here, right now. God is at work in your life, guiding you through your circumstances. God has done his part. He's waiting on you. Now it's your turn. Amen.